Hello, I'm Hannah Donnett with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Che enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnerships, calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che EDC Strategies Partnership webinar, which is the second in our series on PFAS science and policy. The webinar today is titled An Introduction to the Essential Use Concept and its Application to PFAS. Our moderator is Cheryl Patton, Director of Commonweal Biomonitoring Resource Center. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions to the Q&A feature available in the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentations. After the presentation, our moderator will read out questions for our speakers to respond to. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on our webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speaker. This webinar is scheduled to last for 30 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining this webinar. As you all know, we are witnessing an enormous growth in chemical use and production. Many of these chemicals are tested for their effects on human health and ecosystem well-being, but some are not. Some are. And ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, will be releasing shortly over the next few months a database that lists 5 million products that contain chemicals of concern. And of course, it seems here in the US, daily we receive news about PFAS chemicals in drinking water systems. Ohio today, for example, listed 100 drinking water systems in Ohio that contain PFAS levels that should be of concern. Today, Professor Cousins is going to talk about a concept, essentiality, that can help regulate chemicals of concern, we hope more successfully, using the class of chemicals PFAS as a case in point. Ian Cousins has worked at the Department of Environmental Science at Stockholm University since 2002. His research comprises a combination of experimental and modeling approaches to investigate the sources, transport, fate, and exposure of contaminants. He's an expert in PFAS and has conducted research in this class of chemicals for over 20 years. He's the author of 170 peer-reviewed articles and chapters in several books. He was designated as a highly cited researcher in 2018 and 2020, and he was initiated the PERFORCE project, which is a European-wide multi-partner doctoral research training program in the PFAS chemicals, which he coordinates. So, Professor Cousins, I'm very honored and pleased to introduce you and ask you to begin your slide presentation at this time.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. Okay, so I thought I would remind everyone about what PFAS are to start with, and it's not a trivial question, as it turns out. Of course, it stands for perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And Buck et al. In 2011, there's a paper which set out the first definition, and over the years, there's been some arguments about the exact definition of what PFAS are. And I should say this year, the OECD will publish a slightly broader definition of what PFAS are. And simply put, this definition will say that a PFAS is any chemical which contains a CF3 group, a perfluorinated methyl group, or a CF2 group somewhere in its structure, which is a perfluorinated methylene group. Now, the consequence of such a broad definition is that we then have many thousands of substances which belong to the PFAS class of chemicals. And I just looked at the US EPA dashboard, and there they've listed some 9,252 substances which could be PFAS that are used in society. And also, having such a broad structural definition means that you cover a wide diversity of different chemicals. So it includes polymers and non-polymers. It includes chemicals with different charges, so neutral, anionic, cationic, and zwitterionic substances. It contains chemicals that are solids and liquids and also gases, chemicals which are reactive and some that are inert, some that are soluble, some that are insoluble, some that are volatile, some that are involatile, some that are mobile, some that are immobile. So I think you're getting the hang of it now. Basically, they basically cover the full range of different properties that you might expect. So bioaccumulative, non-bioaccumulative, toxic, and relatively non-toxic. So real diversity. But what are the common features of PFAS that make them so useful in a wide range of products? Well, the major characteristics are they all contain these perfluoroalkyl moieties, and these impart very high chemical and thermal stability to the molecules due to the strength of this carbon-fluorine bond, which is often called the strongest bond in organic chemistry. It's very hard to break it. Also, these perfluoroalkyl chains impart both hydrophobic, that's water hating, and oleophobic properties, which is oil hating. And actually, this is a very unique function of PFAS because this is a kind of chemistry which is, as far as I know, not possible to replace this dual hydrophobic and oleophilic nature of the perfluoroalkyl chains. So PFAS have found uses as fluorosurfactants because they can lower the surface tension of water down much lower than hydrocarbon surfactants can. And they're also used as surface protectors because they have very low surface energies compared to hydrocarbon-based or silicone polymers. So, they found uses in non-stick pans, in durable water repellency, in waterproof clothing, and in food contact materials and so on. So they have a wide number of uses in society as a result of these useful properties. And we didn't know quite how many uses until we conducted this study last year. This is a study that was led by a group at ETH Zurich, and the work was led by Juliana Glüge, and she identified more than 200 uses of PFAS for more than 1,400 individual PFAS, and some of these uses are well known, like uses in AFFF and non-stick pans and so on, durable water repellency that we all know of, firefighting foams and so on. But there are many uses here that we didn't know previously. I guess someone knew, but we didn't know before we conducted this study. And some of the major uses, for example, in the production of plastic and rubber, you will find fluorine in lots of different hydrocarbon-based plastic materials because they used to aid the extrusion of molding. And also, so this is a fluoropolymer application, and this is also in the electronic industry. They're used very widely. So if you've got a mobile phone, you have multiple applications of PFAS in your mobile phone or cell phone. And of course, there are lots of less well-known uses as well, which we were surprised of. They're used in ammunition, climbing ropes, guitar strings, artificial turf, and in soil remediation. So this is available for everyone to look at now if they want to find out more about the uses of PFAS. So already about 5 years ago, we started to become really concerned about this class of chemicals, and we published this paper called the Madrid Statement. And in this statement, we called for limiting the production and use of PFAS. And this was based on concerns regarding their high persistence, but also because of lack of knowledge on the chemical structures in the class and also their properties, uses, and toxicological profiles. So we know something about a few PFAS, but there's a wide variety of substances that we really don't have any information on. And we were concerned that because some of the substances that we have studied are problematic, that there could be many more problematic substances in the class. But are all PFAS of concern? Because as I said at the beginning, there are a huge diversity of substances in this class with a wide range of properties. And I also mentioned that, some are toxic and some are possibly relatively non-toxic, and some are bioaccumulative, some are not bioaccumulative. So what's the big deal with all of PFAS? Can we lump them all together and say that they're all of concern? Well, there is one common property that they all have, and that is that all PFAS are highly persistent. And that's because of the carbon-fluorine bond, and this perfluoroalkyl moiety is extremely resistant to degradation. So basically you can say that all PFAS are either non-degradable themselves, or they transform ultimately into stable terminal transformation products in the environment. So we've published a couple of papers here down on the right about the problem with high persistence chemicals. Because if you look over history of contaminants, many of the contaminants of concern have been these ones with very high persistence. And the problem is basically if you continually release chemicals which will never degrade in the environment and are synthetic and you know, they don't have any natural sources like PFAS, you'll get a gradual increase in levels and increasing probabilities of known effects we know and effects we don't know. And so effects or risk is basically inevitable if you continually release these chemicals, because at some place in the environment, they will accumulate over time. And when you do eventually identify a problem, then you cannot do anything about it because the exposure is poorly reversible. You cannot easily take these chemicals out of the environment once they're there. And we're starting to see all of these problems actually for PFAS right now. That is a huge cost of many $billion to actually try and reverse the contamination. So yes, we think they are all of concern. You know, green chemistry advocates developing chemicals which are have design for degradation built into them, and these definitely do not. These are designed to persist. So, you know, we said in the Madrid statement that we wanted to phase out these substances, but it's impractical to ban all uses of PFAS in one step. Some applications may serve a critical role for which alternatives currently do not exist. However, if some uses of PFAS are found not to be essential, they could be eliminated without having to first find functional alternatives. So this is where we sort of came up with this idea of essentiality. And it's not totally new because it was already used in the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And so we've kind of adapted the idea from that particular international treaty. So what about the essentiality of PFAS? So what we want to do is critically evaluate the idea that uses of PFAS are essential in modern society. So we want to test the essentiality of PFAS against the evidence for each use. And, you know, given the thousands of PFAS on the market and the many uses, this is a formidable task. We're not insurmountable, we think. And we tried to adapt the definition of essentiality from the Montreal Protocol. And we've written about it in this paper that you can all read about that was published actually in 2019. Okay, so the definition of essentiality, we came up with 3 different categories. So the first category is a non-essential use. These are the uses are not essential for health and safety and the functioning of a society. And the uses of these substances is driven primarily by market opportunity. And there are uses where PFAS are added to particular products, but they don't really have a technical function. It's difficult to find out why they're there. What purpose are they there for? And this is a non-essential use. And the second category is the substitutable uses. These are uses that have come to be regarded as essential by society because they perform important functions. But there are safe and sustainable alternatives to these substances that have been developed and provide adequate performance that makes the uses of these substances no longer essential. And there are examples like AFFFs now we're starting to see, you know, not essential. We can replace them with other types of firefighting foams, and also water-resistant textiles. We don't need to have PFAS. We can get water repellency from other kinds of chemistries. And the final category is essential. There are some uses which are considered essential by society because they're necessary for health or safety or other highly important purposes, and which alternatives are not yet established. So, for example, medical devices, occupational protective clothing. But these don't need to remain essential. We should encourage innovation so that in the longer term that these uses can be replaced by safe and sustainable chemistries. So I'll just walk you through a few examples to show how it works in practice. So the first use category I have here is the use of PFAS in cosmetics. And up until recently, it wasn't really known that PFAS were used in cosmetics, but they're used in hair products, mascara, foundations, face creams, sunblocks, skin creams, lip pencils, etc., etc. You can read about all of the uses of PFAS in this paper by my colleagues at the top here. What's the technical function? Well, actually, it's quite hard to work out what it is. So this is, I think, is an example of a non-essential use. And there's also a concern here that things you put on your skin could lead to human exposure through dermal or oral uptake. Although there's no evidence for this, there's definitely a concern. And several brands, when this was pointed out, that there's PFAS in your cosmetics, they actually acted very quickly to phase out PFAS. So there are some of the brands listed here. It's not always possible to get a one-to-one substitute, and you might need a new formula, but it's possible to substitute, and this has been done quite quickly. So this is an example of a non-essential use, in our opinion. Another example is ski waxes, and this picture here is from a famous ski race in the country where I live, Sweden, where there's a 90-kilometer cross-country ski race, which takes place every year. And of course, if you want to ski that kind of distance, you don't want to have friction. You want, you want to have an easy job to get through 90 kilometers. And actually, adding fluorinated waxes does help you ski. And it's actually used a lot by competitive, always by competitive skiers, because it gives you a competitive advantage in competitions. And they're containing fluorinated alkanes, but they also contain some pretty hazardous substances like PFOA in very high levels, even to this day. And functional alternatives have always been available. So the likes of you and me, who go cross-country skiing, we would never buy these very expensive fluorinated waxes. There are perfectly functional, non-PFAS based ski waxes which work perfectly well. And actually the International Ski Federation agreed that fluorinated waxes should be banned because they didn't see that this was an essential use. But the problem was that they couldn't find they didn't have any methods for testing, and they were worried about cheating. So unfortunately, this season they were still allowed to be used. So, but the idea is that they will be phased out once adequate test methods become available. Another one is AFFFs, which I think everyone knows is a very well-known use of PFAS. They're specifically used for putting out fuel fires. They shouldn't be used for other kinds of fires, but they're very effective at putting out fuel fires. But it's led to irreversible contamination of groundwater around the world and lots of litigation in many countries. And there have been fluorine-free Class B foams, so-called 3F foams, available since the early 2000s. And actually, now realizing that they meet the standard firefighting performance certifications, many commercial airports have phased out AFFFs and now using fluorine-free Class B foams. But there's still some debate where some people say they are essential, they're the best. And so the military in some countries have been reluctant to phase them out. So you could say that they are in a gray zone between category 2 and 3, although I would say they're definitely substitutable use and fall into category 2. Textiles is an interesting one because it depends on the application of the textiles, which category they fall into. So if you sort of just using your jacket to go to work or go to the beach, you don't need to have oil and water repellency in your jacket. So you can find there are perfectly good alternatives which give excellent water repellency. So you can phase out these Gore-Tex jackets and use fluorine-free alternatives quite easily. But there are some uses where you need to have a higher level of protection, and there's some uses where you definitely need to have this oil repellency, and or at least a repellency against a wider polarity of liquids. A good example is in medical clothing. People who are working in operating theaters, conducting long operations, that want to have a repellency against a wide range of different liquids of blood and saliva and whatever, viruses. Of course, this has become obviously quite a well-known use as a result of the global pandemic. So depending on how much protection you need in a textile, they can fall into different categories. And of course, we've gone through many uses. In the paper, we went through many other uses and tried to put them into different categories, and we're still doing this to this day. So there are many, we've gone through many more uses that are on this slide, and but you can look at the ones in more detail in the paper. This is a table from the paper, and look at the categories we put them in. And you can see, of course, that there's a lot of judgment calls in allocating, whether they're a category 1, 2, or 3. And that's something that would be quite interesting to discuss. So the conclusions and the way forward, we think that the essential use concept can guide the phase out of PFAS. And we particularly think it can guide the phase out very quickly of these non-essential uses. So we've identified a wide range of of different non-essential uses which can be rapidly phased out. There's no need to use those in society. They don't have an essential function in the products. But there are also a lot of category 2 substitutable uses, we believe, where PFAS can be phased out. These are a bit trickier because you want to avoid regrettable substitutions. But there is a field which has been particularly developed in the US called chemical alternatives assessment, which is another branch kind of green chemistry. So there are lots of tools here that are well known and developed in the US, like Design for the Environment, Green Screen, and Cradle to Cradle, that can be used for comparing different chemistries and different products, and and also conducting this for a full life cycle assessment to make sure you don't just introduce problem shifting. You reduce a hazardous chemical, but you increase climate change, for example. So you have to be careful when you substitute one chemical with another. And then even when the PFAS are considered category 3, or essential uses, their innovation should be encouraged to find safer alternatives. And I just finish here. There's some international success stories in the last few years. So PFAS has been banned in paper and board, used in food contact materials in Denmark, for example. There are adequate alternatives for PFAS in these products. Banning of fluorinated ski waxes in international competition, the transition to Class B fluorine-free foams around the world, phasing out PFAS in cosmetics by multiple retailers and brands, fluorine-free durable water repellent outdoor equipment has also been replaced by PFAS-free alternatives. But there are more than 200 uses, so the work is far from done. This is just a sort of scratching on the surface of the well-known uses. So how do we do this? How do we actually enact this change? Well, I believe the systemic change is underway. PFAS are under global pressure, but what are the drivers of change? Well, we actually have a push. People say industry are against this phase out of PFAS, but actually industry is a very broad term, and there are lots of companies, in the chemical industry, and also in the chemical companies that manufacture products that want to phase out PFAS. So there is actually a push from the chemical industry and producers to phase out PFAS. There's also a pull from NGOs, consumers, and authorities which regulate. So this is driving the phase out. And I'm really inspired by the amount of innovation that's actually occurring in industry right now to develop fluorine-free alternatives. So it's not that industry are against this. So there's a real push for sustainability within industry. So there's a lot of industries that are very much in favor of developing green chemistries and phasing out PFAS. But at the same time, there is a pushback from certain parts of industry. In particular, the fluorochemical industry, of course, are working quite hard to say that this idea of essentiality is not a good idea and it's dangerous and so on. So I'd like to finish there. I did have some additional slides, but I think I've used up my time. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and just a few brief acknowledgements of some of my colleagues. It's not only my work, many other people have contributed. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Cousins. And we have some questions coming in, and I will give them to you as they have emerged from our Q&A. What volume of PFAS could you estimate falls into category 1? In other words, if we stopped all non-essential uses, how much PFAS use would be eliminated?
Yeah, I had that question before, and it's hard to it's hard. What you can say is that the major use of PFAS is in fluoropolymers. So if you divide up the whole universe of PFAS, you have the polymers and you have the non-polymers, and then within the polymers, the fluoropolymers, things like PTFE, or sometimes referred to as by the brand name Teflon, is actually the biggest by volume. So if you really want to have a big sort of reduction in the total volume of PFAS, you have to reduce those particular uses, the uses of fluoropolymers. And actually, this is where the big battleground is, because the fluorochemical industry would like at all costs to protect the fluorochemicals. And they would probably sacrifice a lot of the other chemicals, but they would not sacrifice the fluorochemicals. It's a very important area of revenue. So they're actually, you had a talk by Rainer Lohmann previously, so you know about this, but that the fluoropolymers are problematic during their life cycle, in that a lot of problematic chemicals are used in their production. But the industry is trying to say, look, they're not a problematic substance. So they're really trying to fight against the idea that fluoropolymers should even be included within the PFAS class. So I would say the ones we've identified, non-essential uses we've identified, a very small fraction of the total volume of PFAS. If you want to reduce the total volume of PFAS, you have to go after the fluoropolymer uses and claim that they're non-essential. And we haven't really started to tackle that in earnest. But there's one, for example, of PTFE is added to bike chain lubricants, and there's no really good reason why it has to be, why it's added. We had a seminar on a webinar on this before Christmas, and we couldn't, the industry, the people who manufacture these bike chain lubricants really don't think that this really adds anything to the lubricant. Really, it's not really necessary. But anyway, it's added. There's actually this example where it's used to market. It's considered a positive thing from a marketing viewpoint. The PTFE is added, so they're really reluctant to remove the PTFE because they're worried that people won't buy it, because it's really a marketing plus that PTFE is added to bike chain lubricants. So yeah, that was a really long answer to that question, but it's quite a complicated question, actually.
It's an important question, I think.
Yeah.
Your answer, yeah. So what about the criteria for PFAS being different from global region to global region? For example, PFAS may be being used as a fungicide in some area of the world where they don't seem to have an alternative to it, whereas in other areas it would not be considered an essential use because the product wasn't being used.
Yeah, that's totally true. I mean, you use sulfuramide in South America as an insecticide against these leaf-cutting ants, and of course it's a precursor to PFAS. So you get like quite high levels of PFAS which is not a good chemical. It's probably one of the worst. It's probably the worst PFAS that we know of. So it's not good. That's, if it is considered essential, and I guess that they would say that it is in that part of the world, then we really have to have some innovation to think of some alternatives. I mean, it's replaced some other really nasty chemicals. Previously, they used to use organic chlorine chemicals, like Myrex, for example. And now they use sulfuramide, which wasn't a really great step. Wasn't a good step in the, there needs to be some further innovation there. But it's definitely true that there can be some regional differences in essentiality, but that doesn't mean it can't be applied, the concept. It just means that you have to take this into account. I don't think there are many examples of this, but there are some examples where you do have regional differences in essentiality.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Mm.
Here's a question. You will soon start defining criteria for essential use. Will it need to go product by product, case by case to determine what is essential and what not? Or is there another way to define essential use in your opinion?
I think it's really, I don't think it's just the product by product. It's more the function. I think the essentiality of the function in a particular group of products or so on. So I don't think we have to take it product by product, but more sort of like use by use, or function by function. I guess the technical function that is required in that particular use, and look at each of those. So I don't think you have to go. No, you don't have to go, because there's, just if you just consider one particular use, like AFFF or something, there can be hundreds of different products within that particular use category. So I wouldn't want to do it on a product by product basis.
What about precursors, which are used to manufacture PFAS or sometimes product of the manufacturing process itself? Would precursors, how would they be considered under the essential?
Well, they're also a PFAS. Most precursors are PFAS, so they would be flagged as being problematic if they were a precursor, say, for PFOA or PFAS. So they would be considered a hazardous substance, and therefore they should also be substituted and considered, on the basis of if you were going to apply the essentiality concept to them, you could do it the same as a non-precursor. It doesn't make any difference. You would just try and determine, and quite a lot of the uses I've mentioned actually precursors. So the uses of AFFF, the actual chemicals in there are actually precursors to mostly precursors to the hazardous substances. And also in the durable water repellency, the actual chemical, the chemical that's used to provide the durable water repellency is a side chain fluorinated polymer, which is, has impurities in there, which are precursors, and also the side chain fluorinated polymer can be a precursor as well to some problematic chemicals. But it's the same concept, whether it's a precursor or not.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about how would you suggest moving this concept of essentiality around the globe, because we might get countries that are willing to adapt it, but the countries that are actually manufacturing possibly higher volumes, such as China, may not adapt essentiality because
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, I think that we're definitely, I mean, I'm based in the EU, and I think it's going to be a major challenge even there, where we have some progressive thinkers, maybe relative to other countries, and some countries within the EU which are definitely progressive, and the ones that are leading the restriction on PFAS and that have really driven the essentiality concept. So I think the way forward is to try and get, first at least, to just try and get it sort of like incorporated within the EU. And the EU in itself is a big market, and hopefully that will drive countries like China, who obviously want to sell their products to the EU, to adapt. And I don't know, I don't know about the US. But I just, this is what I think: try and build momentum, start small, and then, but aim big. So I think it's still going to be a challenge even to get it implemented, even in the EU to begin with. And I think that's going to be our major focus in the coming years, but largely because I'm based there, but also because I just want to get this concept, a little bit further forward.
Okay. And do we know anything about how much PFAS is used in solar panels? And should we be concerned about those PFAS leaching into water?
I think it's mostly fluoropolymers. So I don't think you should be concerned about leaching, because they will not contain modern fluoropolymers, at least, and they do actually try to reduce the amount of leachables in the products. And the main issue with fluoropolymers these days, at least, is that when they're manufactured, they release a lot of substances, and then you have the issue of how do you dispose of them. But probably there you have a benefit against risk equation, where the benefits of having solar panels and renewable energy are kind of outweigh. Of course, we should look for alternatives as possible, but this is, I don't think you should worry about leachables anyway.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's true.
Mm.
And one last question, because we're really over time, which is Montreal Protocol. One of the exceptions was methyl bromide, on the basis that getting rid of methyl bromide, which is fungicide for strawberries in the U.S., there's concern of products being imported into the U.S. like grapes and logs and dates and such. Not having an exception would mean having a great impact on market. It was an economic concern.
Mm.
It took many years to actually get methyl bromide actually off of use. I think it just got banned in California something like 3 or 4 years ago. That's a long time to wait. So how would you feel of moving that essential to non-essential because of economic concerns, which are real, I think?
Yeah, that's not really my area of expertise, to be honest, but I've heard that this is, a lot of people are worried about this. There'll be a logjam at the end because people are worried about loss of jobs and so on. What I would say is that that even if there are a lot of opportunities as well, when you phase out one substance, there shouldn't be a loss of jobs, because you see already that there are lots of small companies that are set up, that are developing alternatives. So overall in the economy, I don't think there is a loss of jobs. But I think what what happens in the end is certain companies get very worried about the loss of their jobs, and they manage to convince, by lobbying, to stop the change. But overall, I don't think there are lots of jobs. I think there's a lot, when there are lots of new jobs created, and so I don't, but again, as I say, it's not. I'm not looking forward to that bit because that's not my area of expertise. I'm an environmental chemist.
Okay, so thank you very much for for your excellent presentation. We're now out of time, so I want to thank you again. We do have more questions, so maybe we can forward them on to you. And if you have time, we'll get the answers out to everyone. So I need to let everyone know that we do have another panel, a webinar coming up in February that Hannah will talk us about. It's the third in our series about PFAS science and policy. And thanks so much, Ian, for the work you're doing. It's incredibly important. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, shut myself down and turn it over to Hannah.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles and Ian, for your presentation. We're approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. The CHE EDC Strategies Partnership webinar is one and a part of an ongoing series on PFAS science and policy. We'll host the next webinar in this series in February. Stay tuned for the date and details to come. On January 28th, we will also host the third webinar in our Generation Chemical Partnership series titled Preconception Matters Too, EDC Impacts on Reproductive Health and Development. You can find details on our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Cousins. Ian, thank you so much for taking time to present today, and you, Charles, for your excellent moderation. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay well and healthy. We're wishing everybody well. Take care and have a great day.